2 years ago, my wife and I were captivated by an idea. We were hearing about companion crops and soil health, conservation, farming, the whole world of what's happening in the ground that you can't really see from a truck window. And we talked with agricultural specialists, and we decided to turn a pasture on our farm to what we are kind of calling a sunflower habitat. It's not a cash crop, but it's a field for bugs and wildlife, the microorganisms that do their quiet work in the soil, and honestly, for people too. We planted 12 acres of sunflowers, just for what they did for the eye and also, of course, for the pollinators. We planted underneath that what's called an understory of buckwheat and flax and small grains, and we let the volunteers come too. Grass and thistles and lamb's quarters, whatever wanted to grow there. And we didn't clear any of it. We let it all grow together. It is, by any conventional standard, a mess. But it is also, by my standard, one of the most beautiful things on our farm. People walk that field, they pick flowers, they wander, and nearly every one of them asks some version of the same question. Why the weeds mixed in with the flowers? Why aren't there straight rows? Why are there so many bugs? And why do the leaves have holes in them? And I answer the same way to everyone that asks, because that is the way it's supposed to be. That is the way the world actually works. And some people, they smile as if they sort of half knew that. And others just sort of walk away puzzled, wondering, what in the world is that supposed to mean? Now, I tell you that, of course, because that, I think, is exactly what Jesus is doing in this parable. And I don't think that we have been reading what he was meaning the way it was supposed to be read and meant and understood. So here's the story that we heard part of this morning. A man sows good seed in his field, and that night an enemy sows weeds, darnel, most scholars think, right into the same ground and then slips away in the night. And when the plants come up, the servants run to the landowner and they say, "Sir, didn't you plant good seed? Where did these weeds come from?" Now, that opening is not fanciful. It's not made up, because sowing an enemy's field with a ruinous weed was documented village sabotage in the ancient world. It was common enough to show up eventually in Roman law that directly addressed this practice. And the weed itself matters. Darnel. Darnel is wheat's near perfect double. In the blade stage, you cannot tell the difference between wheat and the weed. You can't tell the difference by feeling it, by looking at it. Only once the grain head forms, months after it is planted in the growing season, can anyone tell which is the difference. And by then, the roots have grown so tangled underground that you cannot pull one without destroying the other. Darnel is also mildly toxic, a genuine threat to the harvest and to anyone who eats bread made from a contaminated batch. But there is a second danger kind of folded into this idea of darnel in the field, one that has to do with toxicity and also with the fear of it. And Matthew's hearers would have felt that as they heard this parable being told. Any group would who is fearful of impostors in their midst. It was particularly true for a persecuted church at that time. An imposter that cannot be told apart from the real thing until it's nearly too late is not just a farming problem. It is one of the oldest fears of a persecuted community. The neighbor who might be an informant, the face across the table you can't quite be sure of. That fear was not abstract from the tradition that I came from. During the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptist forebearers of the Peace Church tradition I've spent my ministry inside of met in secret because betrayal was real. It was a constant danger. Michael Sattler helped draft the Sleitheim Confession at a secret gathering in 1527 and then was arrested within months. He was tried and he was executed. Historians estimate several thousand Anabaptists were executed across Europe during the decades that followed. They were drowned, they were burned, they were tortured, and each death authorized by people utterly convinced that they were protecting the true wheat of the church from dangerous imposters growing up among them. Now, I want to be fair to the other side of that fear because it wasn't only paranoia. At that time, there was also a violent, apocalyptic fringe who really did seize the German city of Munster in 1534, descending into forced marriage, mass executions, and a siege that ended in slaughter. It was real proof to the magistrates across Europe that Anabaptism had to be rooted out by force. The tragedy is what that fear then did. It could not tell the difference between the violent fringe and the peaceful majority. So it just didn't try. Sattler had renounced the sword 7 years before Munster and was already dead by the time it happened, killed for the very nonviolence that he confessed. But that distinction didn't make any difference. The wheat and the weed looked enough alike for the magistrate's chair to pull out both. So, when the servant asks, "Do you want us to go and pull up the weeds?" they are not overreacting. That is reasonable, urgent questions from people who know what's at stake on the ground and in the room. And the landowner says, "No, let them grow together until the harvest." Now, I used to read that answer as sort of a shrug, as if evil doesn't matter and oh well, it'll all get worked out in the end. But that's not what is happening in these verses. The landowner knows exactly what darnel can do, and he says no for one reason. The roots are tangled. The roots are tangled, and pulling up the weeds now would tear out the wheat with them. That is not permissiveness. That is the cost of premature judgment, named honestly. God is telling us we do not yet have the standing or the vision or the surgical precision to separate what's tangled together without doing more harm and damage than the weeds themselves ever would do. We still feel that old fear, even now, here. We look at other denominations and churches and we wonder if they've drifted. We look at someone in our own community or maybe even the person 2 pews from you and wonder quietly whether they're really wheat or darnel, wearing wheat's face. And once that question takes root, it asks a second one right behind it. What should we, so sure of our own good seed, do we do to keep the field safe? History has already answered that, and the answer it is not comforting. Every purification campaign in Christian history, and the tradition that I have given my ministry to has really seen the brunt of that, knows that anyone who has tried to purify the church, believing that they were protecting the true wheat, has damaged people in the process. Every one of them killed indiscriminately the true along with the false, and more oftentimes that we want to admit, mostly the true. The servant's question wasn't really about whether the danger was real, because it is. It was about whether we could be trusted to sort it. Friends, we cannot. That same tradition eventually named why these kinds of things happen. An author named Alan Kreider, an Anabaptist author, in his book on the early church, argues that Christianity spread for the first 3 centuries through not through coercion, but through what he calls fervent patience. Christians simply living faithfully, trusting the work of separating the wheat from weed was God's and not theirs. But once the church gained real power under Constantine, patience gave way to compulsion with predictably ugly results. The kingdom of God was never supposed to grow that way. It grows the way a field grows, slowly, tangled, trusting a harvest it does not control the timing of. And that is the theological weight sitting underneath. Let both grow together. Not because evil is fine, but because we are not the harvesters. When Jesus explains the parable, he says the harvest is the end of the age. And again, I think that phrase has done us real harm because the end sounds like a fuse burning to an explosion. But the Greek word there, syntelia, doesn't mean termination. It means consummation, completion. Closer to when the whole thing kind of finally comes to fullness together, is what Jesus is saying here. The harvest isn't God losing patience and swinging an axe. It's the moment growth completes itself and what was tangled becomes clear to see, not because someone forced it apart early, but because it finally is what it always was becoming. We, Jesus says, are the good seed, sown by the Son of Man into the field, which is the world, not gathered into a private greenhouse, sown into the same tangled ground where the weeds are also growing, with real agency right alongside of us, because the field is where the wheat was always going to grow. The explanation ends with one more line. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Again, sorry to say, I think we misread that sentence about as badly as we have misread the end of the age. Seems like we've been misreading things for a long time, right? Ian Modesby, an Anglican priest and theologian, writes it using the words theologians have reached since 1970 instead of kingdom. The word is kindom. You heard me say that at the beginning of the sermon. Kindom is a term coined by Cuban-American theologian Ada Maria Izadias. And she gave the church this idea of reimagining God's reign as a family of equals rather than a hierarchy. And here's what he says. Those who shine are not those who have succeeded in separating themselves from everyone else. They are those who have allowed themselves to be transformed by the patient, merciful love of God. They have learned to trust the good sower more than their own judgments. So, shining isn't the reward of good sorting. It is what happens to a person who stops trying to do the harvester's job and lets herself be grown instead, worked on by the patience she did not generate and cannot rush. The righteous are not the ones with the sharpest eye for spotting darnel. They are the ones who finally trusted the sower more than their own judgment. That sunflower field taught Beth and me something about mess and beauty 2 years before I understood how much I would need it somewhere far harder than dirt. I apologize, but I've been talking over the last few weeks about how my father recently passed away. And it has been harder, as I've told you, than I expected. I've told you that I'm not quite well yet, and that is an honest answer. But something else has shifted in how I am carrying it because of the things that God has been showing me and speaking to me. For most of my life, my instinct with grief was the same instinct Beth and I used to have about that pasture. Treat it like something to be weeded out. Get in there, clear the ground, get back to normal, grieve efficiently on a schedule, and then move on. But I have stopped trying to pull it out. I am letting the grief and the joy grow together in the same ground, the way that sunflower field is tangled every summer now. And here is what I did not expect. It is making me more of a person, not less. Henri Nouwen wrote about ministers as wounded healers, about how our own unhealed places held honestly become exactly the ground where we're able to sit with someone else's pain honestly. The grief hasn't canceled the joy. It's grown alongside of it, root to root, producing a depth of character a cleanly weeded life would never have produced. I think you only get that by refusing to pull. That is a strategy that I have chosen to embrace, and I encourage you to do the same. So here's where I land today. For the farmers and gardeners here who know exactly what I'm describing, for anyone carrying grief along something good, and just since I'm the pastor and get to stand up and tell my stories, the good thing that happened on Saturday morning is my 4th grandson got born. All right? Yay. You know, for the students among us who feel like that they are pressured to understand what is weed and what is weed right now, and for the rest of us who have tried at some point to weed something out of ourselves or out of someone else before it is time, we are not asked to sort the field. We are asked by God to grow in it. Faithfully, patiently, tangled up with things we didn't plant and don't like, trusting the good sower more than our own judgments. Not sorted now, not separated now, growing together until the growing is complete. The sunflowers are blooming out there right now in my field, right alongside the thistle and the grasses that we never once tried to pull. And this fall, the field will finish telling the truth about what it actually is and was, not before and not by force. Let both grow together until the harvest. That's what Jesus says. That was never permission to stop caring about the difference between wheat and weed. It was a promise that the difference will finally be told by a harvester who has never once been in a hurry and who has never once gotten it wrong. that is the way it is supposed to be, that's the way the world actually works. Amen.